Hi, everybody. I would like to begin by thanking the team at the CECC for organizing this vital press conference. And thank you to Chairman Chris Smith and to all the members of the CECC for their enduring support of Tibet and tackling the issue of transnational repression head on. My name is Pema Doma, and I am the daughter of stateless Tibetan refugees. I am an indigenous human rights and climate activist, and I'm also the executive director of Students for Free Tibet. Last month, I was part of the group of cross-movement activists who were targeted by the reality of direct risks and violent repression that Tibetan, Uyghur, and Hong Kong activists protesting against dictator Xi Jinping in the free world. The reality is that these direct risks that we've experienced in San Francisco in APEC this past November has the potential to forever change the reality of activism of Tibetan, Uyghur, and Hong Konger young people and activists in very disturbing ways. On the day of dictator Xi's arrival to San Francisco, cross-movement activists organized a small handful of protesters to unwelcome Xi Jinping. It felt familiar, which is very saddening to say, the level of harassment we had experienced that day. The next day, on November 15th, what I experienced was something I had never experienced before in my life as a Tibetan American who has spent majority of her life here in the United States. Tibetan students and youth activists also made social media videos documenting the harassment and shared it online, which was viewed hundreds of thousands of times by people from around the country. And one of these videos was about something which now we call as a car park incident, where 4 Tibetan students went to a public parking lot and held a banner in a nonviolent form of protest. The banner read, "Dictator Xi, your time is up," a message that millions of Tibetans and billions of Chinese would wish to tell Xi Jinping, but may not have the freedom to. Their hands were in a strap holding this banner nonviolently in a car park where there were a group of about 10 to 15 CCP, what seems like organized group, who violently pulled the banner in a jerking motion, almost causing several students, university students, to fall off the 5th floor of a building. I remember I was at the protest when my phone rang, and it was a 20-year-old Tibetan American student with a voice of fear and panic I have never heard in a young person. He said, "Acha Pema," which means older sister, Pema, "they just tried to pull us off the building. I don't know where everyone has gone. Everyone has been harassed by the CCP agents." It was a level of fear and intimidation I have never experienced a young person conducting activism and protest here in the United States to have experienced. Later that day, there were several incidents of violence and assaults. There were Tibetan young people who had cuts from being poked and stabbed by flagpoles, bruises, and there was a point in which the community had to decide whether or not young people and minors should be allowed to stay at a protest on a public street in San Francisco. And I felt at that moment that I knew that was the exact intention of targeting students. Many of the targeted individuals who were assaulted were minors. They were 15, 16, 17 years old. Some of them had sand thrown in their eyes while protesting. Others had their heads covered and hit with a flagpole several times. And these incidents happened throughout the night. An estimate of about 24 Tibetan students had been physically assaulted over the course of those days. And those assaults, I noticed, were not done against older members of the community or groups of Tibetan uncles or older men. It was all targeted towards young people, students, high school students, college students. And I immediately realized what the tactic of the CCP was. It was to create a sense of panic within the community that the youth would be targeted. And so therefore, action must be taken. Maybe this protest would be unsafe for students or young people. I was very proud that night when the student activists, some of them as young as 16, discussed with their parents and decided they will stay at the protest regardless of the threats. And we as SFT, as Students for Free Tibet, and the other protest organizers quickly mobilized to create safety mechanisms that we can use to protect our own community because as mentioned earlier, there was not much support provided by the San Francisco Police Department. I had to watch as a Tibetan mother cried, her tears, her screaming that her sons were just there, 50 feet away, being beaten, and we couldn't see because they were using flags to cover and they were obscuring the scene. And at that time, I have never felt such disappointment as when the San Francisco Police Department told me, we cannot go there. You cannot go there. And they actually restrained the mother from going to her own child who was calling on the phone, begging for her help. That was an instance where I have never felt so powerless as a Tibetan American person. And it was one that truly haunts me to think that this level of transnational repression could take place, and in fact did take place in San Francisco in November of this year. So all of this transnational repression, it takes place because the messages that the students are sharing, that activists are sharing, are ones that dictator Xi and the CCP do not want the world to hear. So when you think about what were we saying outside of the hotel that night when Xi Jinping was having dinner with Mark Casper, we were raising awareness about the Chinese government's plans to steal the DNA of millions of Tibetan people and Uyghur people. And when you think about when we say the words free Tibet, and Tibet has never been a part of China, and you think about legislation such as the Resolve Tibet Conflict Act here in the United States Congress, these are the exact types of messages that the CCP is trying to obscure. So I would like to end by calling on all of the members of Congress, as well as the CECC and the members of the media, to continue amplifying those messages. On the quickest estimates, it appears that the Chinese government has spent over $500,000 on their project to silence the voices of Tibetans, Hong Kongers, Uyghurs, and Chinese dissidents at APEC Summit in November this year. So the main call to action would be to support these legislations, such as the Resolve Tibet Act, and to continue amplifying the voices of Tibetans calling for an end to colonial boarding schools, to the forced stolen DNA campaign inside Tibet by the CCP, as well as to take transnational repression seriously. Because as a Tibetan refugee, as a daughter of Tibetan refugees, we can see how the repression spreads from Tibet to Nepal and to further around the world. And when we don't say no, when we don't put an end to the transnational repression, it will continue growing and spreading in its intensity, its rigor, and its impacts on the communities affected.
My name is Zhou Fengsuo. I'm currently Executive Director of Human Rights in China. I organized some of the protests in San Francisco Bay Area, including a flying banner over the sky that says, "Free China, Free Hong Kong, Free Tibet, Free Uyghur." And we are glad to stand with our other sisters and brothers from these communities here today. Between November 14 and November 17, more than 2,000 CCP supporters crowded San Francisco streets, viciously attacked at most a few hundreds of protesters of Xi Jinping. Pro-CCP groups were flying from as far as New York City with some well-known CCP supporters leading the charge. They direct these people to use flagpoles to cover the protesters and to attack these protesters. And they identify themselves with red scarf and red headbands all over. We also have a video evidence from one of the students who was with a group that the Chinese embassy bussed in from as far as Los Angeles. Dozens of Hong Kong, Tibetan, and Vietnamese protesters were also forcefully attacked from CCP supporters. My Tibetan friend, Chimi Lamo, was hit on the head many times. Her phone...
For background information, I am one of the 8 Hong Kongers currently with a 1 million Hong Kong dollar bounty on my head. And with that, naturally, I am susceptible to the kind of harassment and assault through transnational repression happening on American soil. But nothing really stood out as much as what I experienced and what I saw last month in San Francisco. Last month, on November 11th, the Saturday before APEC, I announced my arrival in San Francisco on X, which is also known as Twitter. On my post, I invited the public to join our protest to rise against Xi. Approximately 12 hours after the post, I started receiving rounds of comments from pro-Beijing accounts that threatened my physical safety. One of the comments says, "Can somebody drop her unconscious body at the Chinese consulate and Chinese embassy?" The other comment says, "Be careful. This could be your last protest. A million can do wonders." Following the sudden rise in online harassment, I immediately contacted the FBI to file a report. Congressional allies like the CCC and the State Department were also notified of the situation. However, nothing immediate could be really done to discourage further online harassment that I've been seeing. Throughout the few days of protests, we would see thugs who were part of the pro-Beijing protester collectives carrying metal poles around with the intent to intimidate and assault. The scene of thugs carrying poles, harassing and assaulting peaceful protesters brought me and my colleagues back to a traumatizing flashback to the Hong Kong movement. In 2019, thugs actually in Hong Kong gathered outside a metro station with poles, exactly the same poles we saw on scene,
China's state terror reaches far beyond any border. We are also victims of the CCP's harassment campaign right here inside this free country. It's brutal for the CCP to physically torture our families back home as a means of imposing psychological torture on us to force us not to speak out about its atrocities. China employs kidnappers' techniques, targeting us by taking loved ones hostage and attempting to force our compliance with its demands through fear of consequences on them for our actions. By delivering such threats and psychological torture, China breaks American laws with impunity.
My name is Kai-Yu Zhang. On November 17, during the APEC summit, I, 51 years old, and Mr. Zhou, 74 years old, and Mr. Li were ambushed and assaulted by pro-CCP thugs in San Francisco International Airport. It occurred at about 1 p.m. when we were leaving the protest site to our car in Costco parking lot.
Efforts by the CCP to repress opposing voices. I've introduced legislation in the Senate. Senator Merkley introduced it there to take concrete steps to address the issue of transnational repression, introducing in both of our chambers the Transnational Repression Policy Act. It is my sincere hope that this bill will be voted on promptly to become law and hold foreign governments accountable for their actions.